Hi, I'm Simon Phipps, and I'm back at OW2Con again to talk to you a little bit about what the Open Source Program Office at Sun Microsystems did. I'm talking here about something that happened between 1998 and 2010. And it's possible that you don't actually remember Sun Microsystems. Sun Microsystems ceased to exist in 2010 on acquisition by Oracle. Oracle were mainly, it seems, acquiring rights to the Java platform so that they could go sue Google. But prior to that, Sun had existed for a couple of decades and was one of the key innovators in the ICT industry, introducing in particular Sun workstations, and then introducing a range of technologies from TCK-TL to pioneering RPC, to pioneering desktop workstation computing, to introducing Java, to pioneering the use of Java on phones. And most importantly, they were purveyors of the Spark architecture and of the Unix operating system under the name Solaris running on top of that. Sun was a rich source of innovation, and the reason for that was because it had a very open culture, very reminiscent of the West Coast's open source movement, the BSD style open source movement, with people repurposing technology to innovate in ways that the originators weren't necessarily expecting. The original workstation, the company was called Sun because it was a workstation for the Stanford University network that was originally created into a product, was based on open source. The Unix operating system on it was based on BSD Unix, and the maintainer of that BSD Unix distribution, Bill Joy, was one of the founders of the company. And that experience in what came to be known as open source software served Sun very well and allowed it to work well with the internet community and gain a reputation for being the conveyor of the spirit and practice of the internet that led to enormous success at the end of the 1990s. Notably in 1995, Sun Microsystems released the Java platform, and when it did that, this was before the coining of the term open source, and in those days free software was still something of a niche activity, not least for hobbyists. Sun made the Java platform happen spectacularly by making its source available in a way that was unprecedented and very free indeed. I worked at IBM at the time, and I remember at IBM we took the source code to Java and ported it to at least 4 platforms without ever needing to go and negotiate with Sun, as would have been the norm before. And it was revolutionary to have permission in advance to do those ports, even if we didn't actually have permission in advance to then go and distribute and monetize them, which would later become one of the fundamental differences of the open source movement. That being a pioneer, and that having created in many ways the internet and the workstation industries, led to Sun being very confident to the point of arrogance, and really not treating the open source movement very well, and really scorning the Linux platform on x86. It is said that every new area moves through pioneers to settlers to townsfolk, and we discover over time that pioneers make very poor townsfolk. And Sun Microsystems didn't find it easy to settle into the role as just another open source community member. Nonetheless, Sun still did a whole load of open source stuff that made a lasting difference to the software industry and to the open source community. When Sun went open source, which it did in 2004, it went really big. Now, the move towards embracing open source, which was coined in 1998 to 1999, started right away at Sun. And from 1999 onwards, under the leadership in particular of Denise Cooper, who coined the term Open Source Program Office at Sun, Sun made a number of visionary and leading open source moves, such as donating Tomcat and Ant to Apache. A lot of people don't remember that Tomcat was originally Sun's software when it was donated to Apache. These visionary and leading moves were not treated as such by the then open source and free software movement. And that was largely because Sun's resistance to x86 and its resistance to Linux had led it to be treated as an opponent of open source. And its choice of the way to make Java succeed, doing open its own way by making the source code freely available for study and change, but not making it freely available for sharing and use by other parties. Those two facts meant that Sun had a very bad reputation for open source, even though it was actually one of the leading contributors to open source. As the company faced some challenges that were the consequence of previous bad leadership between 1999 and 2001, the leadership of the company changed and a new chief executive came in, and the company made the bold move of making open source its core software strategy. The default changed to all software shall be open source. And by 2010, the open source program office at Sun, which I went on to lead in 2004 after Denise left, had opened the entire Sun software portfolio, including Solaris Unix, including the Java platform, the identity management system, all of the development tools, and even the source code to the Spark silicon chip. So this was a load of work to do. There was a lot of administration and, if you will, lubrication necessary to make open source happen at that scale so rapidly at Sun Microsystems. And that was really the reason why an open source program office was created. Initially just one person. In 2004, I took a role out of the product areas, reporting to the CTO office, and we created an open source program office with a program staff. And that staff did tremendous work in getting all the packages open source and also in other actions. So what exactly did Sun's OSPO do? Well, the first thing I have to say is what it didn't do. It didn't do license compliance. Sun's legal department fully understood the nature of open source licenses, having had to do a lot of open source packaging in conjunction with Solaris already, and in particular, having had to deal with the GPL and free software prior to the coining of the term open source. So Sun's legal department was quite on top of the needs for compliance and created a very effective workflow that didn't need the open source program office's staff to administer. We did act as an approver in the workflow, but we didn't run the process. The other thing that the OSPO didn't do at Sun was any internal evangelism. Really, Sun had open source in its blood. It knew what open collaboration meant. It knew about acting first and seeking forgiveness afterwards. It was a top-down move from the CEO that made open source our strategy. It didn't need selling to anybody. And however, we did have to do quite a lot of business model consulting with product groups. And well, honestly, we did have to do quite a bit of internal advocacy because quite a lot of the product groups didn't think that open source was a business strategy and were very resistant, even though the CEO had told them to get off their asses and go do it. And indeed, by the time Sun Microsystems was shut down in 2010, there were still holdout individuals in leadership roles who believed that they could resist open source in the industry. Some of them went on to work at other companies that they then damaged as well. I won't name any names in that. So what did Sun's open source program office actually do? Well, the most important job that we did was to rebuild and sustain trust from the open source community, which had been lost in a variety of ways by saying bad things about Linux, by not embracing open source in the open source community's way for Java, by being very opinionated when it came to licensing and code. And so we decided we would lead with code. We would make code open. We would talk to open source communities. We would engage in open behavior. And I believe that by about 2005, 2006, people did actually believe that Sun was an open source company. We built public communities around Sun's technology. As the code was made open source, we built direct communities around projects like Open Solaris and OpenJDK. And we also went to existing communities like the Apache Software Foundation. And we built communities around Sun's projects. We started from governance. We didn't add governance later. We tried very hard to use approaches that were truly open. with a view that we would share in the market it created rather than control it. And to do that, we had to build a community of practice inside Sun. We held internal summits. We cultivated blogging through blogs.sun.com. That was really the first corporate blogging platform in the industry. And also we were very present. We ran the very coolest parties, and we had the very best swag. A lot of the t-shirts that Sarah Dornsife from the program office had designed were really quite stunningly original and innovative. We also participated in a lot of conferences as peers, and we sponsored as well. We helped sponsor FOSDEM, for example. We took a whole load of staff to FOSDEM and used it fundamentally as a tool for getting over obstacles in getting Java open source. And we made many, many code contributions. The thing you didn't see was that our OSPO was watching the body corporate. We had staff who were part of the PR function and consequently were entitled to see all the traffic in the press office. And they gave us early warning when bad things like an attempted partnership with SCO were about to happen, which that's something that we stopped happening as it happens. We also had our own legal counsel allocated to us, and that meant we had eyes inside the legal department. And we got to know when there were changes happening in products that might be harmful to our reputation. And then we operated from the CTO office with a direct reporting line to the CEO. And that meant that we had actual authority when it came to saying that something should or should not happen. We tried not to get in the way. We tried to let product teams do their thing. But where there was something really bad going down, once or twice it was necessary to exercise our privilege of being able to ask the CEO to intervene and stop the bad thing from happening. Here's 5 things that you might want to copy in your OSPO that we did at Sun. We ran an ombudsman service. Because we had a reputation for opposing open source, we wanted to give people the opportunity to tell us that they thought we'd done something wrong, rather than to tell the register first. And the ombudsman service was a private and confidential service where you could make a confidential report to Sun, and my team would then work on your behalf inside Sun to get an answer or a resolution for you. That was really quite an effective service. Second thing we did was we ran a datasheet wiki. We found that Sun's hardware hangs around forever, and people who are writing drivers or open source software support for it need data about the drivers and the chipsets. And so as we were able to extract these from the engineering groups, we put them on a wiki so that they remain permanently available. We wrote a lot of frequently asked questions, and I recommend the FAQ as a tool for coordinating inside a company with an open source program office. Writing an FAQ allows you to write down the hard questions that are impolite to make to your VP, and then force people to collaborate over answering them on the pretext that it's going to be a public question. Whether you make the FAQ public or not doesn't really matter, so much as the fact that you have an FAQ which is driving your PR and your product documentation, and which is answering the questions that need answering. A couple of things that you might not be able to copy. We were told at one point that we had some RPC code in the Linux kernel, and we were asked to relicense it, which we did. We were also asked to relicense OpenBoot so that it could be used by other platforms, and we did that. And we also had Emily Suter worked very hard to get the code for the Spark chips released under GPL with the complete toolchain. And we had fabs in the Far East who were making single-core Spark chips using our original designs. Those were just some examples of the way that we tried to be open and the way that we tried to work with other communities. So if you are starting an OSPO, I encourage you to remember how Sun did it. We tried to be radically open. We tried to be transparent and honest with communities. We let the code do the talking as often as possible. And we tried to make sure that we had eyes everywhere in the company to stop our hard work building reputation being destroyed by some other organization's strategy. I'll be very happy to answer your questions about the Sun OSPO. There were many other people involved, and if you look at the earlier slides, there's the URL of the blog post that tells you all about them. And I'll be very happy also if you decide to sponsor the work that I'm doing, unaffiliated with any corporations, to support and promote open source. thank you very much for your attention and time.